Ready to unlock Spanish fluency? We're diving deep into tips and tricks from real learners and experts. We've got Reddit threads, articles from Busuu and Verbal Planet, even a YouTube video. Think of it as unearthing those nuggets of wisdom that really click for you.
Let's do it.
The first thing that pops up everywhere is immersion. It's more than just a buzzword though, right? It's about surrounding yourself with Spanish constantly. Like one Reddit user said, they stopped treating Spanish like a subject and more like a lifestyle.
Interesting approach. It's actually similar to how we learn our first language, When you're a kid, you don't use a textbook, you just absorb it by being around it all the time. Immersion basically recreates that environment, makes learning feel way more natural.
Yeah, that makes sense. There was another Reddit thread where people talked about living abroad in Spanish-speaking countries.
Mm.
They said being surrounded by the language 24/7 made a huge difference. Like they were forced to use it every day, which really sped up their learning.
That's a perfect example of how powerful immersion can be. But let's be real, not all of us can just jet off to Spain. So how do we create that same environment at home?
Well, one thing our sources mention a lot is finding conversation partners. There are so many options these days, like language exchange apps and online platforms. Busuu even has these conversations that simulate real-life scenarios.
Oh yeah, those conversation simulations are great, especially for beginners who might be nervous to talk to a native speaker right away. It's like a safe space to practice and build your confidence.
That's true. I saw some people on Reddit mentioning that fear of making mistakes, but everyone seemed to agree that making mistakes is just part of learning.
It's essential. Actually, a lot of experts believe that fear of messing up is one of the biggest things holding people back from fluency. You got to reframe mistakes as opportunities to learn. Every time you trip up, you learn something new about the language.
And that goes back to making Spanish part of your daily life. We're not talking huge chunks of time either. Our sources talk about a little and often approach. Switching your phone's language, listening to music, even reading out loud, all those small things add up.
It's all about consistent exposure, even if it's just a few minutes every day. One article compared it to exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay, so we've got immersion down, we're not scared of mistakes, but how do we actually start sounding more like a Spanish speaker? Let's talk about pronunciation.
I know it can be intimidating, but the good news is Spanish pronunciation is pretty consistent. Unlike English, where spelling and pronunciation can be all over the place, Spanish is mostly phonetic.
Yeah, one Reddit user said that was a huge relief coming from English. They felt like they could actually trust the spelling. But I think a lot of learners, myself included, get stuck on this idea of the correct accent.
That's a really common myth. The truth is there are tons of different Spanish accents, and they're all beautiful in their own way. For beginners, though, it's good to pick one accent and focus on that, so you don't get overwhelmed by all the variations.
Makes sense, like picking a starting point on a map. Any advice on mastering those tricky sounds? I still struggle with rolling my R's.
Practice is key, of course. Figure out which sounds give you trouble and work on those. For English speakers, the rolled R, the B and B sounds, and the J sound can be tricky. There are a lot of resources online and pronunciation guides that can help you break down those sounds.
I saw a YouTube video where a polyglot recommended this thing called shadowing, basically listening to a native speaker and trying to copy their pronunciation exactly.
Shadowing is a great technique, not only for pronunciation, but it also trains your ear to hear the subtle things in the language. You start to naturally pick up the rhythm and intonation.
Okay, so we've tackled immersion and pronunciation. Now, how do we start building vocabulary? Is it just memorizing lists of words forever?
Well, memorization definitely has its place. It's not the most effective way to learn. The key is to learn in context. Think about it. You wouldn't just try to memorize the whole dictionary. You need to see how words are used in real sentences, in real situations.
So how do we apply that to Spanish?
One good approach is flashcards or vocab apps. They give you example sentences and context. Instead of just memorizing libro for book, you learn the phrase, estoy leyendo un libro. I'm reading a book. This helps you see how the word fits grammatically and in a real-world situation.
That's way more interesting than just staring at a list. The Busuu article also talked about learning common phrases. Seems like a good way to get comfortable with basic conversations.
Absolutely. Getting a few key phrases down can make you feel a lot more confident, even if you're just starting out, like learning greetings, introductions, basic questions like, where's the bathroom? Super helpful for everyday situations.
Yeah, having those phrases ready to go would definitely boost my confidence.
For sure, it takes away that initial fear of not knowing what to say, and you can focus on practicing pronunciation and fluency.
So we've covered immersion, pronunciation, vocabulary. Now let's talk about the big one, grammar. It can be a bit intimidating, right?
Yeah, it's understandable to feel that way, but we need to rethink how we see grammar. It's not just a bunch of rules trying to trip you up, it's a tool to help you communicate clearly.
That's a good way to look at it. So how do we approach grammar without getting overwhelmed?
One strategy is focusing on verb conjugation. Verbs are the backbone of any language, and understanding how they change in different tenses is super important.
Okay, but verb conjugation can be a beast, especially in Spanish. Any tips?
Definitely. One technique is to take it one tense at a time. Start with the present tense, then move to the past, and so on. Don't try to learn everything at once.
Makes sense. I've also heard about creating verb conjugation charts.
Oh, yeah. Those are great. It helps you visualize the patterns and memorize them easier.
And what about grammar exercises? Are those helpful?
Absolutely. They're a great way to test what you've learned and practice applying the rules. You can find tons online or in workbooks.
All right, so we've got some grammar strategies down. But even with the right tools, I think confidence plays a huge role in language learning.
Oh, absolutely. Confidence is key. Actually, a lot of our sources really emphasized just starting to speak, even if you're not perfect.
It's easy to get caught up in that fear of making mistakes.
Mm.
But it seems like embracing those mistakes is a big part of the process.
Exactly. The more you speak, the more comfortable you get. Mistakes happen, but they're also valuable learning moments. And one of the best ways to build confidence is just to jump in and start speaking. Don't worry too much about making mistakes. Just focus on getting your message across.
That's easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah.
I know I've definitely frozen up before, especially when I was first learning.
I get it. It's a normal reaction, but the more you put yourself in those situations, the less scary they become. I read a tip on Reddit that resonated with me. They started small by practicing with friends or family who already spoke Spanish.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It takes
Yeah.
the pressure off.
Right. And they also mentioned joining online language exchange communities. It's a great way to connect with native speakers and get used to different accents.
I was just reading about those language exchange apps on Reddit. Seems like a fun and easy way to find people to talk to.
Definitely. Apps like HelloTalk and Tandem are great for that. You can text, call, even video chat. It's like having a language partner in your pocket.
Speaking of pockets, the Verbal Planet article had this cool tip about flashcards. They said to carry a small stack with you and review them whenever you have a few minutes.
That's a smart way to fit in some vocab practice. The important thing with flashcards is to use them actively, not just flipping through. One thing I do is try to make sentences with the words, even if they're silly. It helps the words stick in your memory.
That's a good tip. It reminds me of spaced repetition systems. Apps like Anki use algorithms to show you flashcards at different intervals. It's supposed to help you remember things long term.
Oh yeah, spaced repetition is really effective for learning vocabulary. It's based on the idea that reviewing things at specific times helps us remember better, way better than cramming.
So we've got flashcards, spaced repetition, any other vocabulary building tips. It feels like a lot of learners get stuck there.
One thing I recommend is focusing on words and phrases that are relevant to your interests. Like, if you love cooking, start learning vocabulary related to food and recipes.
That makes sense. Makes it more fun and you're more likely to actually use the words.
Exactly. And while you're at it, pay attention to cognates. Those are words that look and mean the same in English and Spanish.
Oh yeah, cognates are a lifesaver. I was so happy when I realized how many words I already kind of knew.
Right. It's a good feeling. Makes the language seem less scary.
So we've covered immersion, pronunciation, and vocabulary. But what about grammar? It can be a real sticking point for some people.
Grammar is essential for clear communication. But it doesn't have to be this horrible thing. It's about finding what works for you. Some people like structured grammar lessons. Others prefer a more immersive approach.
Yeah, I'm definitely more of an immersive learner. I learn best by seeing grammar in action, not just memorizing rules.
And that's totally fine. There are tons of resources that support that. Reading real Spanish texts, watching movies, listening to music, it all exposes you to grammar naturally.
I bet that helps you get a feel for the language.
For sure. It's about developing an intuition for how it works.
One thing I always struggle with is verb conjugation. It feels so complicated.
Yeah, it can be a challenge, but there are ways to make it easier. One technique is to group verbs based on their endings. Like verbs ending in "r" usually follow the same patterns, and so on.
So it's about finding patterns instead of memorizing every single conjugation.
Exactly. It's way less overwhelming that way. Another tip is to practice conjugating verbs in real sentences.
So instead of just drilling yo hablo, tú hablas, I should say things like yo hablo español con mis amigos.
Exactly. It's more engaging, and you see how the verbs are actually used.
I remember a polyglot recommending immersing yourself in Spanish media. Things like watching movies, listening to music, even playing video games.
That's such a good way to make learning fun. You're exposed to the language in a real way. You pick up new vocabulary, hear different accents.
I've been watching Spanish movies with subtitles. It's amazing how much you pick up just from listening to how people actually speak.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to start with content made for learners. There are tons of great podcasts, YouTube channels, even Netflix shows for beginners.
That's a good point. Starting with something you can understand can really boost your confidence.
For sure. It's all about finding that right level of challenge. You want to push yourself, but not get overwhelmed.
Speaking of pushing ourselves, I read a tip about setting realistic goals. It's easy to get carried away and set unrealistic expectations.
Definitely. It's important to break things down into smaller, achievable goals. Instead of saying, I want to be fluent in 6 months, focus on something like, I want to have a basic conversation about my hobbies.
I love that approach. It seems way less scary and more rewarding.
And don't forget about positive reinforcement. Celebrate your progress, even the small steps.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in the end goal and forget to enjoy the journey. What are some good ways to reward ourselves for our Spanish progress?
It depends what motivates you. It could be watching your favorite Spanish movie or having a nice meal at a Spanish restaurant. Just find something that makes you feel good and keeps you going.
And I imagine that sense of reward keeps you motivated in the long run.
Absolutely. Learning a language is a marathon, not a sprint. You got to find ways to make it enjoyable.
I saw a tip from someone who started incorporating Spanish into their hobbies. Like if they liked cooking, they try Spanish recipes.
That's so creative. It makes learning more meaningful and connects it to your life.
I love that. It's about weaving Spanish into your routine.
Exactly. It becomes part of who you are. It's not just learning a language, it's expanding your world and connecting with a new culture.
And those connections can be so rewarding. I read about someone who said learning Spanish opened up a whole new world for them. They could connect with people from different cultures, travel to new places, experience new things.
That's the amazing thing about language learning. It breaks down barriers and lets us connect on a deeper level.
And those connections can last a lifetime.
Absolutely. The relationships you build and the experiences you have are often the most valuable parts of the journey.
We've covered a lot today: immersion, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar. We even touched on the importance of confidence, motivation, and making learning enjoyable.
And the main message is clear. Learning a language is a journey, not a destination. Embrace the challenges, celebrate the wins, and most importantly, have fun.
Wow, we've really uncovered some gems today. Everything from creating that immersive environment to nailing pronunciation, building vocabulary, tackling grammar. We've covered so much.
It's amazing how all these pieces fit together. Immersion helps your vocab and pronunciation. Practice builds confidence, and grammar becomes a tool instead of a roadblock.
Like putting a puzzle together, each piece is part of the language learning journey.
Exactly. And as you go, you'll find what works best for you. Some people like structured classes and textbooks, others are more into immersion and real-world practice.
I was reading about someone on Reddit who learned mostly from movies and music. They said they just absorbed the language naturally.
That's awesome. It shows how important it is to find methods that click for you. The key is to try different things until you discover what works best.
And that goes back to one of the biggest themes we've talked about: confidence. It seems like
Right.
believing in yourself is crucial.
Oh, absolutely. Confidence keeps you going even when things get tough. And remember, mistakes are part of the process. Embrace them. They help you grow.
One of my favorite quotes from the Reddit threads was, "Fluency isn't about perfection, it's about progress." It reminds you that language learning never really ends.
I love that. And as you go, don't forget to celebrate the small wins. Every new word, every conversation, every time you understand a little more, those are all wins.
It's like those little boosts that keep you going,
Yeah.
especially when things get hard.
Speaking of challenges, remember, you're not alone. There's a huge community of Spanish learners out there, both online and offline.
I saw some Redditors talking about language exchange meetups. Sounds like a fun way to practice.
They're great. And don't underestimate online communities. Platforms like Duolingo and Babbel have forums where you can connect, share tips, and practice.
And then there are all the apps, podcasts, YouTube channels. It's amazing how much is out there.
It really is. There's no excuse for not finding something that keeps you interested.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into a Spanish fluency, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away?
I hope they remember to enjoy the journey. Learning a new language is an adventure. It's about discoveries, connections, possibilities. It's more than just words and grammar. It's about a new culture, a new way of seeing the world.
That's a great way to put it. I hope our listeners feel ready to take that first step, whether it's downloading an app, joining a class, or just listening to a podcast for a few minutes.
Even the smallest step can make a big difference. And as you go, have fun, embrace the challenges, and celebrate every win.
We'd love to hear about your journey. Share your experiences with us on social media. Let's build a community of learners who support each other. Until next time, keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep that passion for Spanish alive.
Hasta pronto.